The city of Harmon Falls had a bus problem, and Deja Collier knew it better than anyone at City Hall ever would. She knew it the way you learn things when you have no other choice. She knew it in her legs, which ached after the quarter-mile walk from the nearest stop to the warehouse where she ran the overnight shift at a linen service. She knew it in her daughter's face, 7-year-old Zoe, who would fall asleep waiting in the after-school program because the last route to their side of town ran at 4:45, and Deja could never make it by then. She knew it in the $18 she spent every month on car service apps, because the buses simply stopped serving the North Pullman neighborhood at 8 in the evening, as if the people who lived there stopped needing to travel when the sun went down. Harmon Falls was not a small city. It had a transit authority and a published schedule and a website where you could plan a route if your destination existed in the parts of the city the route served, which North Pullman, on a good day, halfway did. The neighborhood had been promised a coverage expansion in 2019 and again in 2021. Both times the proposal went through committee and came back with suggestions for further study, and nothing changed. The stops that existed kept existing. The coverage that stopped at 8 kept stopping at 8, and the people who needed to move after dark kept walking, or paying or staying home. Deja was 31 years old, raising Zoe alone, and she had been taking buses in Harmon Falls for 6 years. She knew every route, every gap, every 70-minute dead stretch where a connection should have been. She knew which stops had shelters and which had nothing but a painted curb and the cold. And she had believed the way people believe in a city that has never rewarded that belief, that eventually someone with a desk at City Hall would notice and fix it. She stopped believing that on a Tuesday in November. Zoe had a fever. Not severe, not the kind that sends you to an emergency room, but the kind that made her daughter curl into herself and ask for water in a small voice. Deja left work early, took 2 buses to get to the after-school program, and then discovered that the pharmacy on their end of North Pullman had closed at 6. The next one that was open was on the other side of a neighborhood called Glenwood, and there was no direct route. She would have to transfer twice in the cold, with Zoe drowsy against her shoulder. It took an hour and 20 minutes to get there and back. The children's fever reducer cost $4.79. The time cost something she could not price. That night, after Zoe was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Deja sat at the kitchen table with her phone and her laptop, which was 3 years old and had a cracked corner on the screen. She opened a mapping application and started tracing routes. Not bus routes that existed, routes that should exist. She spent 2 hours drawing lines between the places people in her neighborhood actually needed to go. The pharmacy, the urgent care clinic on Marsh Street, the food bank on Delray, the community college where a lot of the night students lived in North Pullman. She drew those lines until almost 2 in the morning, and then she sat back and looked at what she had. She did not call it anything yet. She just looked at it. She had no background in technology. She had gone to school for hospitality management and had worked in laundry services for 3 years before Zoe's father left, and the math of their lives changed completely. She knew how to use spreadsheets. She knew how to make a budget hold together under pressure. She did not know the first thing about making an application, about data structures, about transit APIs or back-end code. She had time, though, not much of it, and not at a convenient hour, but she had the hours between 10 at night and 1 in the morning, after Zoe was asleep and before the exhaustion dropped her completely. And she decided, with the quiet stubbornness that had been carrying her through 3 years of single parenting, that she was going to use them. There was no dramatic moment of decision, no voice from somewhere, no clear plan, no belief that this would work. There was only the recognition that she already knew what the problem was, that she had been living inside it for 6 years, and that no one else was going to map it for her. That was all. She opened the laptop and she started searching. The first thing she learned was how to type a search that got her somewhere useful. She had known how to search the internet, but she had not known how to search it for learning, which is a different skill. A search like, how do I make an app, returns 10,000 things that assume you already know what you do not know. She spent the first week learning how to ask better questions. She found free courses, video tutorials, documentation pages she could not yet read but bookmarked anyway. She learned what a programming language was. She learned what the difference was between front-end and back-end development. She learned what a database was. She learned that there was a version of the city's bus schedule available in a machine-readable format, and she did not yet know what machine-readable meant, but she wrote the phrase down on a notepad by the laptop and went to bed at 1:30 knowing she would come back to it. She learned these words in the same kitchen, at the same cracked corner laptop, while the building settled around her in the cold, and Zoe slept behind the closed bedroom door. She learned them in 2 and 3 hour increments, tired in the way she had been tired for 3 years, but thinking in a way that felt different from anything she had thought about in a long time. The things she was learning had a shape. They connected. A concept she had not understood on a Tuesday would click into place on a Thursday and open up the next 3 things, and she would sit there past midnight with the feeling of something assembling itself, slow and irreversible. The first month she learned the basics of a language called Python. She was not fast at it. She made mistakes that took her 2 or 3 nights to find and correct. She would sometimes write 20 lines of code that refused to run, and she would stare at them until she found the single comma she had forgotten, and then she would feel a satisfaction so specific and clean that it surprised her. It was not the satisfaction of having done something easy, it was the satisfaction of having understood the mistake completely, which meant she would not make that exact one again. She began to understand why people made things this way. There was a logic to it that rewarded patience, and patience was something she had in quantity. She did not tell anyone what she was doing, not her mother, who would have worried, not her co-workers on the overnight shift, who were good people but who had their own exhaustion to carry. She kept it to herself the way you keep something that might not survive being described too early. She was 31 years old, and she had been through enough false starts to know that some things need to grow in the dark for a while before they can stand the light. If you're still watching this, think about what Deja was building. Not a hobby, not a side project with a plan, just a mother at midnight teaching herself a new language one mistake at a time. And what she was building was for every person in her neighborhood who had ever stood in the cold waiting for a bus that was never coming. Drop a comment if you've ever been that person, because this story is for you. The second month, she found a free resource specifically about transit data. She had not known that transit data was a public thing, that the city published something called a GTFS feed, which is General Transit Feed Specification, a standardized format that describes bus routes and stop times. She downloaded Harmon Falls' feed and opened it and stared at it for 3 nights before she understood what she was looking at. Then she understood it very well, because she had been studying those gaps for 6 years without knowing she was studying them. She understood it the way you understand something you have carried in your body. She could see the North Pullman Gap immediately. She could see the Marsh Street Dead Zone and the Cedar Hill South Corridor, and the way the evening service thinned out across the whole east side of the city like blood draining from a hand. Other people would have needed context to read that data. Deja had the context already. She had walked it. She had stood in it in the rain with a child on her hip. She built her first small program in the 5th month. It was not impressive by any standard. It took the city's GTFS feed, compared the route coverage to a rough population map she had assembled by hand from census data, and spat out a list of neighborhoods sorted by what she called gap density. Her neighborhood, North Pullman, was at the top of the list. She had known it would be. She ran it 3 times anyway because seeing it confirmed in numbers, her numbers, from a program she had written herself at midnight in her kitchen, was something she needed to feel. The 3rd time she ran it, something went wrong in the code, and it crashed. She found the error, fixed it, ran it again. North Pullman, still at the top. She sat back and took a breath. The kitchen was cold. The clock said 1:47 in the morning. She had a shift in 4 hours, and she had not yet slept. She closed the laptop and went to bed, and she was asleep in under 3 minutes, and she slept better that night than she had in a month. Zoe found her awake one morning at 6 before school and asked what she was doing. Making something, Deja told her. What kind of something? Something that might help people get where they need to go. Zoe considered this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to things they have decided matter. Zoe had a way of listening that Deja had noticed when she was very small, a way of going still and attending completely, like the rest of the world had been placed on pause, while she thought about what you had said. She was not like that about everything. She was like that about things that struck her as real. Like the bus? Zoe asked. Like a better bus? Zoe nodded and went to pour herself a bowl of cereal, and that was the whole conversation. But Deja thought about it for a long time afterward. A better bus. That was exactly what it was, and hearing her daughter say it made it feel more real than any of the hours she had spent alone. Some things need someone else to name them before you can see what they are. She had been at it for 8 months when she told anyone other than Zoe. Her neighbour Lorraine, who was 63 and had lived in North Pullman since before the neighbourhood was called North Pullman, stopped her in the hall one evening and asked why she looked like she hadn't slept in half a year. Deja told her the short version. She told it quickly and without drama because she had been holding it by herself long enough that the drama had gone out of it, and what was left was just the plain shape of what she was doing. She was mapping transit gaps. She was teaching herself to code. She was building something she did not have a name for yet. Lorraine listened without interrupting, which was not something Lorraine always did. She had opinions about most things, and she usually offered them freely. When Deja finished, she stood in the hallway and looked at Deja for a moment with something that might have been wonder, and then she said, "You know my nephew works at the community college, right? In the computer science department." Deja had not known this. His name was Phil, and he agreed to look at what she had built. He met her at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Zoe was at her grandmother's, and he spent an hour going through her code. He did not say anything condescending, which she had been prepared for and which did not happen. He asked questions. Some of them were simple, some of them were not, and she answered all of them, because she had written every line herself and knew exactly why each one was there. What he said mostly was, okay, yeah, I see what you did here." At the end of the hour, he pushed his glasses up and looked at her. "This is actually solid," he said. "The data pipeline is clean. The gap analysis is real." She had not known what to do with that, so she said, "I know there's stuff wrong with it." "There's stuff I'd do differently," Phil said, "but the logic is yours and the logic is right. You need to build a front end so people can actually use it, and you need to refine the algorithm. But the bones are there." He paused. "How long did this take you?" 8 months, she said. "Nights, mostly." He was quiet for a moment. "While you were working?" "Overnight shift," she said. "I'd get home at 6, sleep, and then work on it in the afternoon and at night." He was quiet again for longer this time. Then he said he would help her if she wanted, and he would bring in one of his students who was good at the interface side of things, a young woman named Chris, who was in her junior year and who had been looking for a real project to work on. Deja said yes, and they shook hands, and after Phil left, she stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet and let herself feel something that was not quite relief and not quite disbelief. Something in between. The three of them worked together for the next 7 months. They met on Saturdays at the kitchen table and sometimes in the evenings at the community college library, and sometimes Phil and Chris would send her things to look at during the week, and she would work through them on the nights she was not on shift. Phil gave her a framework for thinking about the algorithm more rigorously, showed her how to stress test it against edge cases, how to account for seasonal route changes and holiday schedules in the GTFS data. He did not rewrite what she had built. He helped her understand it at a deeper level, and then she rewrote it herself because that was the only way she was going to actually know it. Chris built the interface. She was 21 and had a gift for making complicated things look simple. She built a clean map with a search field and color-coded gap scoring by zip code, and she made the route overlay tool interactive so you could draw a proposed route and see the estimated coverage change in real time. Deja watched her work and asked questions about every decision because she needed to understand the interface as well as the back end. Chris was patient with the questions. She said once, on a Saturday afternoon when Zoe was doing homework at the other end of the table, "I want you to be able to explain every piece of this. You built it. You should be able to explain it." Deja never forgot that. She did most of the underlying data work, the things she had taught herself to do in the first 8 months, which no one had taught her, and which she therefore understood in a way that went all the way to the foundation. When she understood something, she understood it completely because she had had to learn it with nothing to fall back on. That turned out to matter more than she had expected. There were decisions baked into the data methodology that only made sense if you understood why she had made them, and she was the only one in the room who had, because she had made them at midnight in a cold kitchen with a cracked laptop and no one to consult. The app was called Reroute. Not a dramatic name, not a startup name, a name that said exactly what it did. You put in a neighborhood, it showed you the transit gaps, it showed you what a gap closing route would look like, and it showed you the estimated ridership impact based on census and trip pattern data Deja had painstakingly assembled over 15 months. Phil helped her clean that data. Chris made it look like something a city official could open without confusion. Deja made sure it was right. They put it online in the 14th month. They put it online quietly without a press release or a social media strategy because none of them had the time or money for that. Deja shared it in 2 community Facebook groups in North Pullman. She shared it in a neighborhood newsletter that Lorraine had been sending out by email since 2014. She shared it with a woman named Vera, who ran a tenants coalition on the east side of the neighborhood. And Vera shared it with 43 other people. And one of those people was a city council aide named Marcus Webb. Marcus had grown up 3 blocks from Deja's building. He was 26 years old and had been working for council member Patricia Owens for a year and a half. He had a notebook on his desk that he filled with things constituent meetings surfaced, things people mentioned that never made it into formal channels, gaps in city services that nobody with authority had gotten around to naming correctly. He opened Reroute on his phone on a Wednesday afternoon, idly, because a woman in his building had texted him the link with a note that said, "Your boss needs to see this." He spent 40 minutes with it before he put his phone down. Then he picked it up again and spent another 20. What he was seeing was not a rough community project. It was a working analytical tool. The gap scoring was methodical. The proposed route overlays were specific and costed, showing not just where the gaps were, but what it would take in route hours and stop additions to close them. There was a section Deja had added in the last month that cross-referenced the gap zones with public health data, emergency clinic wait times, and food access scores, and what it showed was a map of consequences. Not just inconvenience, concrete harm, documented and visualized and mapped to the city's actual neighborhoods. The neighborhoods with the worst transit gaps also had the worst health outcomes, the highest clinic wait times, the lowest food security scores. It was not a coincidence Deja had mapped. It was a system. And she had put it in a form anyone with a phone could look at. Marcus scrolled back to the top of the app and found the developer credit. Deja Collier. He wrote the name in his notebook. Then he looked up the North Pullman neighborhood on the app's gap map and sat there for a long moment looking at the colors. The red zones were the worst. North Pullman was red. He had grown up in North Pullman. He called his supervisor at 8 the next morning and said he needed 20 minutes. Councilmember Owens gave him 30. Deja did not know any of this was happening. She was running the overnight linen shift, and she was doing what she had been doing for 2 years. She came home at 6 in the morning, slept until Zoe's school day started, walked Zoe to the bus stop, came home, slept another 3 hours, woke up at noon, ate something, and sat at the laptop until the next shift. She was tired in the way that becomes a permanent weather, something you stop noticing because it is always there. The app was out in the world, and she was glad it was there, and she had no particular expectation of what would happen next. She had not built it to launch it. She had built it because it needed to exist, and what happened to it after that was out of her hands. It was a Thursday afternoon when the email came in. She almost deleted it because the subject line said it was from the office of the Harmon Falls City Council, and she had learned over 3 years of sending emails to official addresses that official addresses did not write back. She read the first 2 sentences before she sat down slowly in the kitchen chair. Councilmember Owens and the Office of Transit Policy wished to schedule a meeting with the developer of Reroute, an application they had reviewed and found to have significant analytical merit. Would she be available the following week? She read it 4 times. Then she called Yav Phil. Phil laughed in a way that sounded like relief. "I knew it," he said. "I knew somebody was going to find it." "I don't know what I'm walking into," Deja said. "You're walking in with the tool," Phil said. "That's all you need." The meeting was on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon at City Hall. Deja borrowed a blazer from Lorraine, who was a similar size and had a dark green one that fit Deja through the shoulders. She arrived 12 minutes early and sat in the waiting area and looked at her hands. She had printed out a 4-page summary of Reroute's methodology because she had learned in years of shift work that the people who arrive prepared are the people who get taken seriously. And she intended to be taken seriously. The waiting area had a row of blue chairs and a large seal of the city on the wall, and a receptionist who asked her twice if she could get her anything. And she said no, twice, politely, because she had learned to be polite in rooms where she could feel the effort it took to be seen as belonging. She was wearing Lorraine's blazer and her own slacks, which she had pressed that morning at 5:30 before Zoe woke up. She had her laptop in her bag. She had the printed summary. She was ready. Council member Patricia Owens was a small woman in her late 50s with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She had a directness that Deja recognized immediately as the kind that comes from not having time to waste. She shook Deja's hand at the door and said, "I want you to know I went through your app myself. Not just a summary. I sat with it for about 2 hours." Deja had not expected that. "Walk me through the gap scoring algorithm," Owens said, and they sat down. It was the first time anyone at that level of city government had ever asked Deja to explain something she had built, and she felt the strangeness of it for about 30 seconds. Then she started talking, and the strangeness went away because this was her data, her logic, her 2 years of midnight work, and she knew it completely. She knew it the way she knew Zoe's bedtime routine and the bus schedule and the route from her building to the linen service warehouse. She knew it because she had built it in the only hours she had, with no room for uncertainty, and so there was none. Marcus was in the room, taking notes. There was also a woman from the Office of Transit Policy named Sandra, who asked the technical questions, and Deja answered every one of them. There was a moment about 40 minutes in when Sandra said, "How did you source the trip pattern data?" And Deja explained the methodology she had used, which was painstaking and not simple, and Sandra looked at Owens and said, "That's actually more rigorous than what the contractor used on the 2019 study." Owens looked at Deja. Deja looked back. There was a silence in the room that lasted about 4 seconds and that Deja remembered for a long time after. "How long did this take you to build?" Owens asked. 2 years, Deja said. "Roughly, nights and weekends." Owens was quiet for a moment, then she said, "While working full-time." "Overnight shift," Deja said. "Linen service?" Something moved across Owens's face that was not pity. It was closer to the look a person gives when they have underestimated something and realize they need to recalibrate. The kind of look that does not announce itself. It just shifts the room slightly. "Miss Collier," she said, "what did you want to happen when you built this?" Deja thought about November, about Zoe and the fever and the hour and 20 minutes in the cold. She thought about the cracked corner laptop at the kitchen table. She thought about the first program that crashed and the satisfaction of finding the error and the way the gap density list looked when it ran cleanly for the first time. She thought about what Zoe had said at 6 in the morning, matter of fact as only a 7-year-old can be, a better bus. "I wanted someone to fix the gaps," she said. "I wanted to give them the information to do it. I didn't figure anyone would, but I wanted to make sure the information was there." Owens folded her hands on the table. "Here is what I am going to tell you," she said. "I have been on this council for 11 years. I have been trying to get a serious transit equity study funded for 4 of those years. My office has been given 2 contractors' proposals in that time. Both of them were expensive, and neither of them showed me anything I could actually use to make an argument for route expansion." She paused. "Your application does. It shows me the gaps, it shows me the cost of the gaps in human terms, and it shows me what a solution looks like. I want to know what it would take for the city to license this." The room was quiet. Deja said, "I'm sorry?" "License it," Owens said, "as an official analytical tool for the Transit Policy Office. We would pay you a licensing fee, we would credit you as the developer, and we would use it to make the case for what I am going to propose. A pilot program expanding service to 4 gap zones in North Pullman, Delray West, the Marsh Street Corridor, and Cedar Hill South." She looked at her notes. "Those 4 zones account for 62,000 residents who currently have inadequate bus access after 7 in the evening." Deja had known that number. She had calculated it herself on a Wednesday night in January at 11:15 in the kitchen. Hearing it said aloud in a council meeting room by a woman with 11 years of elected service and a seal of the city on the wall behind her felt like something physical, like the ground finding a new level beneath her feet. "I want to be honest with you," Owens continued. "Licensing would mean your tool is vetted by our legal and tech offices. That process takes time. It also means I am recommending it publicly, which means scrutiny. I don't think it will fail scrutiny based on what I've seen, but I want you to know what you'd be walking into." She paused again. "What would you want in a licensing agreement?" Deja looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "Proper credit," she said. "And I want to be in the room when you use it. I want to be able to explain it to whoever needs to understand it, because I know it better than anyone else is going to know it." Owen smiled, and it was a real one. "That," she said, "I can promise you." Deja walked out of City Hall at 4:20 in the afternoon. The spring light hit her full in the face. She stood on the steps for a moment, and the city moved around her. Buses and cars and people with places to be, and she thought about how many of them were going somewhere the buses did not go, and she thought about the 4 routes and the timeline and the 4 zones and 62,000 people. Then she walked down the steps and toward the bus stop, and she caught the 4:45 heading north, and she stood in the aisle with her bag on her shoulder and a printed 4-page summary still in her hand, and she wrote it all the way home. The vetting process took 4 months. It was not always easy. The city's technology office sent back a 12-page document of questions, and Deja answered everyone, sometimes with Phil's help on the technical language, mostly on her own. She answered them at the kitchen table, the same cracked laptop that she had now owned for nearly 4 years. She answered them during the hours she had always used for this, after Zoe was asleep, in the quiet that she had turned into something over 2 years of not wasting it. There was a moment in the 3rd month when a senior analyst in the tech office sent an email that was not rude but was skeptical, noting that several methodological choices were unconventional. The analyst's name was Hargrove, and he wrote in the formal, careful language of a person who expected to be right. Deja read his email twice, and then she set the laptop aside and went to wash the dinner dishes and think. Hargrove was right that the choices were unconventional. He was wrong that unconventional meant unjustified, and she knew exactly why she had made every one of those choices, because she had had to justify them to herself at 2 a.m. with no one to verify them against. She wrote back a 4-paragraph response explaining each choice, citing the specific data constraints she'd been working within and why the unconventional approach produced a more accurate output given those constraints. She did not apologize for the choices. She explained them. The analyst wrote back 2 days later and said, simply, "Accepted." She kept that email. She did not know why exactly, except that it felt like a kind of receipt. There was also a week in the 2nd month when the legal office had questions about data provenance, wanting documentation that the census and public health data she had incorporated was properly attributed and within public use terms. She spent 3 evenings that week pulling together the documentation, the original source citations she had maintained in a notes file from the beginning, because Phil had told her in the 1st month to always write down where she got the numbers. She had done it. The documentation was clean. The licensing agreement was signed on a Friday morning in the spring. It was not a ceremony. It was 2 lawyers and Deja and a city notary, and Marcus Webb, who had brought a small plant from the plant shop on Delray because he had not known what else to bring. Deja looked at the plant when she came in, and something in her chest unlocked. She signed her name 4 times and shook hands with the city attorney, and walked out into the April sun with a check representing the first licensing payment in her hand, and a phone call she needed to make. She called Lorraine first because Lorraine had lent her the blazer, and because some things you tell the person who was there at the beginning. Lorraine cried. Deja did not then. She walked the 6 blocks home. She had not owned a car in 2 years, and the buses in her neighbourhood were what they had always been, and she did not mind. She was aware of every stop she passed. She was aware of what they were and what they were not, and what they were going to be in the fall when the pilot programme routes came online. She was thinking about 62,000 people and what the evening looks like when you can get where you need to go. She was thinking about a pharmacy and a fever and a child on her hip in the cold, and how one November night can turn into 2 years of midnight work if you let it. Zoe was at school. Deja let herself into the apartment and set her bag on the kitchen table, the same table where she had started, the cracked corner laptop still in its spot. She made a cup of coffee and sat down and looked at the machine for a long time. It had been with her for 4 years now. She had been meaning to replace it for 2 of them, but she had never gotten around to it, and some part of her was glad. There was something right about finishing on the same machine she had started on. Something about continuity. She thought about all the things that had not been in her plan because there had been no plan. There had been only the problem and the kitchen table and the time she had, and she had turned those three things into something the city was now going to use to redraw the map of where people could go after dark. She had not known that would happen. She had not believed it would happen. She had done the work anyway because the alternative was to know the problem was there and do nothing, and she was not built for doing nothing. Zoe was at school. Deja let herself into the apartment and set her bag on the kitchen table. The same table where she had started, the cracked corner laptop still in its spot. She made a cup of coffee and sat down and looked at the machine for a long time. She had not taught herself to code because she had believed it would work. She had not sat at that table at midnight for 2 years because someone had told her it was a good idea. She had done it because the gaps were there and the information needed to exist, and she was the person who happened to be paying attention. That was the whole reason, and it had been enough. There is something about knowing a problem from the inside that no amount of professional study can replicate. She had not known this as a principle when she started. She had just been angry in a particular way, the specific anger of someone who has asked for help and watched nothing happen, and she had turned that anger into something she could point at. 2 years of midnights, of learning what a comma did and what a database was and how a transit feed worked, and what she had made in the end was not just a tool. It was proof. Proof that the gaps she had been living inside were real, documented, measurable, and fixable. No one could look at Reroute and say the problem did not exist. The problem was right there on the map, in numbers she had calculated herself, with methodology that had passed scrutiny in the city's own technical office. She opened the laptop. The screen came on. There were 3 more neighbourhoods she had flagged in the data. Cedar Heights, the far east side of Portside, and a stretch along the Mill Road corridor that had not been served well since a route restructuring in 2018. She had not done the full analysis on those yet. She had the data, she had the tool, and now she had something she had not had 2 years ago. Evidence that the tool could move people who had the power to change things. She started a new file. When Zoe came home from school that afternoon, she found her mother at the kitchen table working. She dropped her backpack by the door and looked at what was on the screen. The familiar map, the colour-coded zones, the lines that traced where people needed to go. "Did something good happen today?" Zoe asked. Deja looked up. She thought about the check, folded now in the inside pocket of Lorraine's blazer, still hanging on the hook by the door. She thought about the signed agreement and the city attorney and the small plant Marcus had brought, which was sitting on the kitchen windowsill in the afternoon light. The same light that had been coming through that window since she and Zoe moved in. Warm and gold and ordinary. She thought about the 4 routes and the 62,000 people and the fall timetable that was now officially in motion. She thought about the November night and the fever and the hour and 20 minutes in the cold, and how you cannot always tell what a night is going to turn into until 2 years have passed and you are sitting in a room with someone asking you to explain your methodology. "Yes," she said. Zoe climbed into the chair beside her and looked at the screen with the same seriousness she had brought to the conversation at 6 in the morning, 2 years ago, when none of this existed yet. "Are you making something again?" "I'm always making something," Deja said. Zoe leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. Deja put her arm around her daughter and turned back to the screen, and the kitchen was quiet and warm. And outside the window the afternoon light came in gold across the table, and on the map the 3 unflagged neighbourhoods waited, patient as all the people inside them, for someone to finally draw the lines. Kindness done in the dark has a long memory. So does work done for the right reasons. Deja had known that, on some level, before she had words for it. The midnight hours had taught her the rest. If Deja's story stays with you, drop something in the comments. What do you think changes when the people who live with a problem are the ones who solve it? And if you want to see more stories about quiet people doing something worth remembering, there is one waiting for you right after this one. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, organizations, and events depicted are imaginary and are not intended to represent any real individuals or institutions.